1940, the world believed Britain was finished. The math said bombers would always get through. Hitler believed it. Göring promised it. So when the Luftwaffe crossed the English coast, they expected panic. Empty skies, surrender. Instead, they flew straight into a weapon they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and didn't understand. No new planes, no secret superbomb, just radio waves, quietly guiding British fighters to the right place at the right time. This is the story of the invisible shield that broke the myth of German invincibility and changed modern warfare forever.
There is a specific kind of quiet that older generations remember better than the youth of today, a silence that precedes a storm. In the summer of 1940, if you stood on the pebbled beaches of Kent and looked across the English Channel, the horizon looked deceptively peaceful. The water was a shimmering blue and the sky was an endless empty canvas. But many of us who study history know that this empty sky was perhaps the greatest illusion ever maintained in modern warfare. It was a vacuum that Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring believed they could fill with the sheer, crushing weight of the Luftwaffe. You see, at that time, the world believed in a very simple, terrifying rule: the bomber will always get through. This wasn't just a slogan, it was a mathematical certainty for the military minds of the 1930s. If you sent 200 planes to hit a city, the defenders might shoot down 10, maybe 20, but the other 180 would drop their payloads. Therefore, the Luftwaffe entered the Battle of Britain not just with planes, but with an absolute, unshakable confidence. They believed they were invisible until the moment their shadows fell over London. But while the German pilots looked at that empty blue sky as an open door, the British were busy building a fence. Not a fence of wood or steel, but a fence made of invisible light. To understand why the Luftwaffe's invincibility was a myth, we have to look at the massive steel lattice towers that began appearing along the British coastline. To a casual observer or a German reconnaissance pilot, these looked like oversized radio masts, perhaps a desperate attempt at communication. But in reality, they were the chain home stations. While Göring was polishing his medals and boasting about the Eagle attack, British scientists like Robert Watson Watt were perfecting a way to bounce radio waves off of metal aircraft. Imagine, if you will, a dark room. You are trying to catch a fly. If you have to wait until you hear the buzz near your ear, you've already lost. But if you have a flashlight that can illuminate the fly while it's still across the room, the advantage shifts entirely to you. Radar was that flashlight. The Luftwaffe relied on the element of surprise. Their strategy was built on the knockout blow, the idea that they could appear over British airfields before the Hurricanes and Spitfires could even warm their engines. But the invisible fence changed the fundamental physics of the war. Suddenly, the British didn't need to keep standing patrols. If you've ever worked in logistics or aviation, you know how exhausting it is to keep men and machines in the air 24/7. It burns fuel, it wears out pistons, and it drains the spirit of the pilots. But because of radar, the Royal Air Force could sit on the ground, sipping tea and waiting. They weren't being lazy, they were being efficient. Therefore, when the German formations were still over the middle of the channel, long before they could see the white cliffs of Dover, the British controllers were already picking up their size, their altitude, and their heading. Think about the psychological shift that occurs when a surprise attack is met by a waiting enemy. History suggests that Hitler's biggest mistake wasn't just a lack of planes, it was a lack of imagination. He trusted in what he could see, thousands of Heinkel bombers and Messerschmitt fighters. He didn't account for what he couldn't see, the pulses of energy radiating from those lonely towers on the coast. Many of us remember the old adage that knowledge is power, but in 1940, knowledge was survival. The invisible fence didn't just track the Luftwaffe, it stripped them of their greatest weapon, the ability to dictate where and when the fight would happen. Every time a German pilot crossed that invisible line, he was no longer the hunter, he was the hunted. The Luftwaffe's hubris was built on the empty sky theory, the belief that the ocean and the clouds were a shroud. But the British had turned the very air itself into a tripwire. This wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a cultural one. It required the British to trust a flickering green line on an oscilloscope over the reports of human observers. It was the first time in history that a war would be won by the side that better understood the electromagnetic spectrum. But, as we shall see, having the flashlight was half the battle. You still had to have the nerves to stand your ground when the light revealed a monster coming straight for you. The gap between seeing the threat and stopping it was where the real tragedy and the real heroism of 1940 took place. If you've ever spent time under the hood of a classic car, you know that horsepower doesn't mean a thing if the cooling system can't handle the heat. You can have the biggest engine in the county, but if you haven't built the radiator to match, you're eventually going to end up stranded on the side of the road with a seized block. In 1940, the German Luftwaffe was that high-horsepower engine. It was sleek, it was loud, and it was terrifyingly fast. But as we look back with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that Hermann Göring had built a sword without ever bothering to forge a shield.
Hermann Göring himself was a man of the Great War, a fighter ace who lived for the glory of the dogfight. Therefore, when he took the reins of the Luftwaffe, he didn't build an air force designed for endurance or protection. He built a weapon of pure, unadulterated aggression. To Göring and the Nazi high command, the very idea of defense was seen as a weakness. They believed that if your offense was fast enough, you would never need to worry about someone hitting you back. It was the ultimate glass cannon strategy. To understand the sword, we have to look at the tools Germany chose to put in their shed. They poured their marks and their man-hours into the Ju-87 Stuka and the Messerschmitt Bf 109. These were magnificent machines for a short, sharp fight. The Stuka was a surgical instrument capable of diving at near vertical angles to drop a bomb on a specific bridge or a tank. It was the flying artillery that had shattered Poland and France in weeks. But history suggests that what works on a battlefield in Flanders doesn't necessarily work in a protracted campaign over the English Channel. The Stuka was a sword with a short blade. It was slow, vulnerable, and required total air superiority to survive. The moment it faced a coordinated defense, that invincible weapon became a liability. But Göring's doctrine wouldn't allow for a pivot. He was convinced that the sheer psychological terror of the Luftwaffe would break the British spirit before the technical flaws of his aircraft could be exposed. This brings us to the missing shield. While the British were investing in the Dowding System, a complex network of observers, telephone lines, and radar, the Germans had almost no equivalent. Many of us remember the importance of situational awareness from our own careers, whether in business or the military. The Luftwaffe, for all its power, was flying blind. Consider the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the backbone of the German fighter force. It was arguably the best interceptor in the world in 1940. It was faster than the Hurricane and could outclimb the Spitfire. But it had a fatal flaw that perfectly mirrored the Göring doctrine. It had no legs. Its fuel capacity was so limited that a pilot taking off from France only had about 20 minutes of actual combat time over London before he had to turn around or risk ditching in the Channel. Imagine trying to win a marathon when you've only trained for a 100-meter dash. That was the reality for the Luftwaffe pilots. They were flying a sword that was incredibly sharp but incredibly heavy to hold. Every minute they spent looking for the British was a minute they weren't fighting. And because they lacked a defensive radar shield of their own, they had no way of knowing where the British Hornets were coming from until the tracers were already whizzing past their cockpits. Therefore, a strange paradox emerged during the summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe was technically winning the numbers game, but they were losing the strategic war. They were destroying British planes, but they weren't destroying the British system. Göring's doctrine also ignored the shield of logistics. Germany failed to develop a heavy four-engine strategic bomber, what many pilots called the Earl bomber. They stayed with medium bombers like the Heinkel HE-111. These were fine for supporting tanks on the ground, but they lacked the defensive armament and the payload to truly knock out a modern industrial power. It was like trying to knock down a brick wall by throwing 1,000 pebbles instead of one sledgehammer.
But why did they make this choice? It comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. The German High Command viewed the air as a secondary theater to the land. They saw the Luftwaffe as a servant to the Blitzkrieg. They never imagined a scenario where the Air Force would have to win a war entirely on its own, across a body of water, against an enemy that could see through the clouds. As we look at the maps of the era, the tragedy of the German pilot becomes clear. They were sent into the killing zone with the best engines in the world, but with a strategic plan that was already obsolete. They were told they were the masters of the sky, but they were actually being led into a trap designed by men who understood that a sword is useless if your opponent can see your strike coming from a mile away. The sword was sharp, yes, but it was brittle. And as the weeks of the Battle of Britain turned into months, the lack of a shield, both technical and strategic, began to show. The Luftwaffe was bleeding its best men and its most expensive machines in a fight they hadn't planned for. They were trying to punch a ghost. Many of the veterans from that era would tell you that the most frightening thing in a fight isn't the man who hits hard, it's the man who refuses to go down. The Goering Doctrine was built on the idea that one hard hit would end the fight. When Britain didn't fall, the Luftwaffe had no plan B, no way of protecting their own bases from retaliatory strikes, and no way of countering the invisible radio waves that were dissecting their formations with surgical precision. Ultimately, Germany built a weapon for a world that no longer existed, a world where the fastest plane always won. They didn't realize that the world had changed. The era of the ace was being replaced by the era of the system. And in that transition, the sword without a shield was destined to break.
In our lives, we've all seen the difference between a project that has too many cooks in the kitchen and one that is run with military precision. You can have the best tools in the world, but if the communication breaks down, the job fails. In 1940, the British didn't just have a new tool in radar, they had a management system that was decades ahead of its time. It was called the Dowding System, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. And while the Germans were focused on the glory of flight, Dowding was focused on the math of survival. He turned the British Isles into a giant living machine, a tactical guillotine that waited for the Luftwaffe to stick its neck out. To understand why this was so revolutionary, you have to realize that before Dowding, air defense was basically guesswork. You'd put a man on a hill with binoculars, and if he saw a plane, he'd run to a telephone. By the time that message reached a fighter base, the enemy was already gone. It was reactive, slow, and frankly, hopeless. But Dowding changed the therefore of the equation. Because he had radar, he could see the enemy coming. Therefore, he didn't need to guess. But he knew that seeing the enemy was only step one. The purple value here, the real secret of the Battle of Britain, wasn't just the radar towers, it was the filter room. Imagine a room deep underground, safe from the bombs. In the center is a massive table with a map of the English coast. Around this table are women, members of the WAAF, holding long wooden poles, moving markers across the map like they're playing a giant game of chess. This was the filter room, and it was the world's first high-speed data processor. Every radar station along the coast was sending in blips. Some were real, some were just interference from birds or the weather. If the pilots had to react to every single blip, they'd be exhausted in a day. The filter room's job was to take all that noise and turn it into truth. They would cross-reference the radar data with reports from the observer corps, men on the ground who were listening for engine noises and identifying plane types. Once they had a track, they decided a number. This was the moment the guillotine began to rise. Many of us who have worked in high-stakes environments know that the biggest enemy is often information overload. Dowding knew this too. He didn't want his pilots or his commanders to be overwhelmed by the big picture. Therefore, he decentralized the power. He broke the country into groups, and those groups into sectors. Each sector had its own operations room. They only saw the track that was relevant to their specific patch of sky. This meant that a sector commander in Biggin Hill didn't have to worry about what was happening in Scotland. He only had one job: look at the map, see the enemy marker moving toward his base, and scramble his Spitfires at the exact second that would allow them to reach the enemy's altitude just as they crossed the coast. It was a masterpiece of timing. The Luftwaffe pilots would be flying along thinking they were in a vacuum, only to find a squadron of hurricanes waiting for them, often with the sun at the British pilots' backs. This is where the guillotine metaphor truly takes shape. The British were using the Germans' own momentum against them. The Luftwaffe was forced to fly in predictable paths to reach their targets in London or the coastal docks. Dowding System allowed the RAF to be force multipliers. Even though they had fewer planes, they were always in the right place at the right time. But there was a human element to this system that we shouldn't overlook. Hugh Dowding was a man many called stuffy. He wasn't a socialite. He wasn't looking for headlines. He was a man who cared deeply about his chicks, as he called his pilots. He knew that every time he sent a young man into the sky, there was a high probability he wouldn't come back. Therefore, the Dowding System was designed to be as safe as war can be. Because of the radar and the telephone lines, if a British pilot was shot down over England, the system knew exactly where he fell. A rescue team could be dispatched in minutes. This meant that a pilot could be shot down in the morning and be back in a new cockpit by the afternoon. Compare that to the Luftwaffe. If a German pilot was shot down over Kent, he was out of the war. He was either dead or a prisoner. The Dowding System wasn't just killing planes, it was winning the attrition game by preserving Britain's most valuable resource: experienced pilots. History suggests that the Germans never truly understood the Dowding System. They thought they were fighting a bunch of individual, brave pilots. They didn't realize they were fighting a synchronized, automated network. They would bomb a radar tower, see it stop transmitting for a few hours, and assume it was destroyed. But the British had mobile backup units and repair crews that could have those towers back up before the next German wave even landed back in France. It was a radio wave war that the Germans were trying to fight with Iron Age tactics. Think about the sheer stress of being a German bomber pilot. You cross the channel, the sky looks empty, but you have this nagging feeling that you are being watched. You look at the horizon, and suddenly, like a ghost appearing out of the mist, there are 12 Spitfires diving on your formation. You haven't even seen the coast yet, and the guillotine has already dropped. This system gave the British something more than just tactical advantage. It gave them certainty. In a world of chaos, Dowding provided a framework of order. He proved that a smaller, smarter force can defeat a larger, blunter one if they control the flow of information. As we look at the legacy of 1940, we see the birth of the modern world. Every air traffic control tower, every cellular network, every GPS system owes a debt to the Dowding System. It was the first time humanity harnessed the invisible spectrum to organize our physical world against a threat. But for the men in the cockpits, the few that Churchill spoke of, the Dowding System was simply the invisible hand that guided them to their target. It was the voice in their headset that told them Vector 090, Angels 20, giving them a chance to strike a blow for freedom before the empty sky swallowed them whole. The Luftwaffe entered the battle trusting Hitler's bravado. The RAF entered the battle trusting Dowding's math. And as we know, in the end, the math was the only thing that held up under fire. If there's one thing we've come to respect about German engineering over the decades, it's precision. Whether it's a timepiece or a transmission, the German philosophy has always been built on the straight line, the most efficient path between 2 points. In the early days of 1940, the Luftwaffe decided to apply this exact philosophy to nighttime bombing. They developed a system called Knickebein, or crooked leg. It was a marvel of technical accuracy, designed to guide a bomber to its target with a margin of error no wider than a few hundred yards. But as many of us have learned the hard way, the more precise a tool is, the easier it is for someone else to throw a wrench in the gears. To understand the Knickebine system, imagine two massive radio beams being projected from stations in occupied France and Norway. One beam would act as the path. The pilot would hear a steady tone in his headset as long as he stayed on course. If he drifted left, he'd hear dots. If he drifted right, he'd hear dashes. Therefore, even in total darkness or heavy cloud cover, a German pilot could fly a perfectly straight line toward a British city. The second beam was the trigger. It would intersect the first beam directly over the target, say a factory in Birmingham or a shipyard in Liverpool. When the pilot heard the two tones merge into one solid signal, he'd know it was time to drop his payload. It was, for all intents and purposes, a prehistoric version of GPS. The Luftwaffe felt invincible because they believed the British were literally in the dark. They assumed that because England didn't have this technology, they wouldn't even know it existed. But this is where German precision met British ingenuity. The British had a young scientist named Reginald Victor Jones, a man who looked more like a schoolteacher than a warrior. Jones had a hunch. He'd heard rumors of these mysterious radio beams and decided to investigate. He convinced the RAF to send up an old Avro Anson equipped with a sensitive American radio receiver. On a cold night in June, while flying over the English countryside, the technician in the back of the plane suddenly shouted. He had found it, a thin, invisible river of radio energy flowing straight toward an English city. This was the realization that the Germans had built a system so rigid that it could be hijacked. Now, if you or I found a leak in a pipe, our first instinct might be to plug it. But the British were much craftier. They didn't want the Germans to know they'd discovered the secret. Therefore, they didn't try to block the beams. Instead, they decided to bend them. They started a project codenamed Headquarters. They took old hospital diathermy machines, devices used for heat therapy, and modified them to broadcast a signal on the same frequency as the German Knickebine. They placed these jammers across the countryside. Imagine you're a German pilot. You're flying through the pitch-black night, trusting your headset implicitly. You hear the steady tone that tells you you're on course. But unbeknownst to you, the British have subtly layered their own signal on top of yours. They've bent the beam. The pilot thinks he's flying over a munitions factory, but in reality, he's 5 miles away, dropping his bombs into an empty cow pasture or the middle of the ocean. This was the Knickebine blunder. The Germans were so confident in their technical superiority that they didn't bother to encrypt the signal or change the frequencies. They assumed the primitive British couldn't possibly understand the physics involved. But British ingenuity turned that German precision into a liability. As we look at the results of these beam wars, the statistics are staggering. On some nights, less than 20% of German bombs fell anywhere near their intended targets. The Luftwaffe commanders were baffled. They would look at the reconnaissance photos the next morning and see craters in the middle of nowhere, while the factories they thought they'd destroyed were still pumping out Spitfires. History suggests that this was the moment the German sword began to dull. Because they couldn't see the invisible war being fought in the airwaves, they started to doubt their own equipment. Pilots began to lose faith in the steady tone in their ears. Some began to ignore the beams altogether, returning to old-fashioned navigation by the stars, which was far less accurate. Therefore, the crooked leg became a broken leg. The British hadn't just saved their cities, they had struck a blow to the psychological foundation of the Luftwaffe. They proved that the invincible German machine was vulnerable to a bit of clever thinking and some repurposed medical equipment. It reminds us of a truth we've seen play out many times in our own lives. The most sophisticated system in the world is only as good as the person operating it and the person trying to break it. The Germans have the sword of technology, but the British had the shield of intellect. But as the war dragged on, the Germans wouldn't stay fooled forever. They would try to refine their beams, leading to the X-Garret and Y-Garret systems, each more complex than the last. But by then, the British had established a radio countermeasures unit that was always one step ahead. The Knickebine blunder was the first major electronic defeat in history. It taught us that in modern war, the loudest explosion isn't always the one that does the most damage.
Sometimes it's a quiet scientist in a lab turning a dial and bending a beam of light that changes the course of history forever. If you've ever managed a large-scale operation, you know that the most dangerous moment is when you decide to change your strategy halfway through. You've put in the legwork, you've gathered the resources, and you're inches away from the goal, but then frustration or ego takes over and you pivot. In August of 1940, the Luftwaffe committed exactly this kind of strategic suicide. They called it Adeltag, Eagle Day. It was supposed to be the day the German Eagle finally tore the heart out of the British RAF, but instead it became a masterclass in hitting the wrong targets at the wrong time. The original plan was sound from a military standpoint. To invade England, Hitler needed to control the skies. Therefore, the Luftwaffe's primary objective was simple: destroy the RAF on the ground. They targeted the airfields of 11 Group, the frontline bases like Biggin Hill, Kenley, and Hornchurch. For a few weeks in late August, this sword was actually working. The British were losing planes faster than they could build them, and more importantly, they were losing pilots faster than they could train them. But here is where the purple value of the story takes a dark turn. The Germans didn't realize how close they were to winning. Because of their lack of intelligence, the shield we discussed earlier, they believed the RAF was down to its last 50 Spitfires. They saw the British fighters still rising to meet them and assumed, incorrectly, that their current strategy wasn't working. Therefore, on the cusp of total victory, Hermann Göring made a fatal pivot. He was frustrated by a small symbolic British bombing on Berlin. It was a pinprick, really, but it wounded Hitler's pride. In a fit of rage and ego, the command was given: stop attacking the airfields, stop hitting the radar stations, start hitting London. This was the fatal flaw. The Luftwaffe shifted their focus to civilian targets, the Blitz, and the Luftwaffe gave the RAF a breather they desperately needed. Imagine you're a boxer. Your opponent is wobbling, his legs are gone, and one more punch to the jaw will end the fight. But instead of throwing that punch, you decide to start hitting his ribs because you want to make him suffer. You've moved away from the winning target to the emotional target. That is exactly what the Luftwaffe did. Many of us remember the images of London burning, the Black Saturday of September 7, 1940, when nearly 1,000 German aircraft swarmed the city. From a purely destructive standpoint, it was a success, but from a strategic standpoint, it was a catastrophe for Germany. While the East End was burning, the repair crews at Biggin Hill were filling in craters, the mechanics were fixing Merlin engines, the pilots were getting their first full night of sleep in weeks. History suggests that if the Luftwaffe had stayed focused on the airfields for just 10 more days, the Dowding System would have collapsed. The invisible fence would have had no hounds left to release. But because they attacked the wrong target, the British were able to regroup. Think about the sheer logistics of this mistake. By moving the targets to London, the German Bf 109 fighters, which already had that dangerously short leg we talked about, were pushed to their absolute limit. They had even less time to protect their bombers. Consequently, the RAF, now refreshed and reorganized, was able to climb high above the Thames and dive into the German formations with devastating effect. The Luftwaffe was trying to break the spirit of the British people, but they forgot that you can't break a spirit with bombs if the enemy still has a sword in his hand. This brings us to a truth that many of us have seen in our own lives. Intelligence is only as good as the person interpreting it. The German intelligence officer, Joseph Beppo Schmid, was notorious for telling Göring what he wanted to hear rather than what was true. He reported that the RAF was exhausted. Therefore, Göring felt he could afford to move the targets to London to satisfy Hitler's desire for vengeance. But the reality was the opposite. The RAF wasn't exhausted, it was evolving. As the German bombers flew over the smoking ruins of London, they looked down and thought they were seeing the end of the British Empire. But if they had looked behind them, toward the airfields they had abandoned, they would have seen the real threat, a rejuvenated force that was now better coordinated, better led, and more determined than ever. The wrong target didn't just save the RAF, it saved the war.
It turned a tactical battle into a war of attrition, a war that Germany, with its sword without a shield, was never equipped to win. Many veterans of the Blitz spoke of the London spirit, the defiance of people sleeping in the underground, the business-as-usual signs in shattered shop windows. But the real salvation of London didn't happen in the streets, it happened in the skies, because the enemy had forgotten his objective. As we look back, we see that Adeltag was the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's invincibility. They had the power, they had the precision, but they lacked the discipline to finish the job. They let their emotions dictate their strategy, and in the high-stakes world of 1940, an emotional strategy was a death sentence. In any trade, the most dangerous man in the room is the one who thinks he's already learned everything there is to know. We've all seen it, the foreman who won't listen to the new specs, or the executive who ignores the data because it doesn't fit his gut feeling. In 1940, that man was the collective leadership of the Third Reich. They had spent years convincing themselves that German engineering was not just superior, but fundamentally untouchable. This hubris, this pride before the fall, created a technical blind spot so massive that it eventually swallowed their entire ambition of a 1,000-year Reich. The purple value of this failure lies in a single staggering fact. The Luftwaffe never truly believed that British radar was an integrated system. They saw the towers of Chain Home and, in their arrogance, labeled them as primitive. They assumed that because the towers were large, stationary, and unshielded, they couldn't possibly be sophisticated. They judged a book by its cover, and it was a mistake that would cost them the war. You see, the Germans actually had their own radar, the Freya and Würzburg systems. In many ways, their individual units were technically better than the British ones. They used shorter wavelengths and were more portable. Therefore, because they had better hardware, they assumed the British primitive hardware was a non-threat. But as we've discussed, the British didn't just have hardware, they had a network. History suggests that the German mind at the time was obsessed with the duel, the idea of one-on-one combat between superior machines. They couldn't conceive of a system where a girl with a telephone and a wooden pole was just as important as the pilot in the cockpit. This was the blind spot. They were looking for a sword to fight, and they didn't realize they were already caught in a net. Because of this hubris, the Luftwaffe High Command made a decision that sounds almost unbelievable today. They stopped attacking the radar towers. After a few half-hearted raids in August, Hermann Göring famously remarked, "It is doubtful whether there is any point in continuing the attacks which we have hitherto made on the radar stations, since none of those attacked has so far been put out of action." Think about that logic for a second. It's like a plumber seeing a leak, hitting it once with a hammer, and then deciding that because the water is still flowing, the pipes must be indestructible. Instead of redoubling their efforts to cut the eyes out of the British defense, they simply gave up and looked for an easier target. Therefore, the invisible fence remained standing. Throughout the most critical weeks of the Battle of Britain, those towers continued to pulse, feeding data into the Dowding System. Every time a German pilot took off from France, he was a blip on a screen before he was even a shadow on the water. And yet, the German leadership continued to tell their pilots that the RAF was down to its last few planes. Imagine the psychological toll on those German air crews. You were told the enemy is dead, but every time you cross the coast, the ghosts of the RAF are there waiting for you. This creates a crisis of confidence. When the reality on the ground or in the air doesn't match the propaganda from the top, the morale of even the finest soldiers begins to rot. But the price of hubris went deeper than just the Battle of Britain. This technical blind spot set a precedent for the rest of the war. Because they failed to understand the importance of electronic warfare in 1940, the Germans remained behind the curve for years. While the Allies were developing microwave radar, proximity fuses, and advanced jamming techniques, the Nazi leadership remained focused on wonder weapons, massive rockets like the V-2, and jet fighters like the Me-262. They wanted the home run, when what they needed was a solid defense.
Many of us who have spent a lifetime building things know that success isn't usually found in the flashy, it's found in the reliable. The British radar was reliable. The Dowding System was reliable. The German hubris was a flashy mask that covered a hollow strategy. By the time the Luftwaffe realized the true power of the invisible fence, it was too late. The United States had entered the war, the RAF had grown into a global powerhouse, and the sword of the Luftwaffe had been blunted against the shores of England. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was already beginning to crumble, not because of a lack of bravery from his pilots, but because of a lack of humility from his generals. They trusted in their invincibility, they trusted in their steel, but they were defeated by silence and radio waves. It serves as a sobering reminder to all of us, no matter how strong you think you are, if you stop watching the horizon, if you stop respecting the invisible threats and the primitive competitors, you are already on the path to obsolescence. The Luftwaffe didn't lose because they were outflown, they lost because they were outthought. They were blinded by the very light they thought they had mastered. As we move into our final reflection, we have to ask ourselves, what are the invisible fences in our own lives today? What are the signals we are ignoring because we think we're too experienced to listen? The ruins of the Luftwaffe offer a haunting answer. As we sit here today, it's hard to imagine a world without a silent watcher. We live in an era where we can track a package across the ocean in real time or see a storm gathering hundreds of miles away on a local weather app. We take for granted that the air around us is filled with invisible information. But as many of us who have lived through the decades know, this modern convenience was bought and paid for in the smoke and fire of 1940. The beams that once guided bombers and the waves that once hunted them didn't just fade away when the guns went silent. They became the very foundation of the world we built after the rubble was cleared. The Battle of Britain was the true birth of the information age. Before 1940, warfare, and indeed life, was a matter of physical presence. You had to be there to see it. You had to be there to stop it. Therefore, the victory of the invisible fence wasn't just a military win, it was a shift in the human experience. We stopped relying solely on our eyes and started trusting in our instruments. Think about the next time you visit a local airport to pick up a grandchild or a friend. You see the massive rotating radar dishes near the runway. They look almost identical to the chain home technology of 1940, just refined and miniaturized. Every time a commercial airliner lands safely in the fog, it is using the descendants of the Nickelbein and the Dowding System. The silent watcher that once scanned for Heinkel's now ensures that millions of people can travel the globe without ever fearing the empty sky. But the legacy goes deeper than just aviation. History suggests that the frantic technical race of the 1940s accelerated our understanding of physics by 50 years in the span of 5. The development of the magnetotron, the heart of the Allied radar that eventually won the war, is the exact same technology that sits in your kitchen today, inside your microwave oven. It's a poetic irony. The power that was once harnessed to detect the instruments of death is now used to warm a cup of coffee on a quiet morning. Many of us remember the Cold War, the era of deep space surveillance and early warning systems. Those were simply the Dowding System grown to a global scale. We spent decades living under the protection of the silent watcher, a digital shield that kept a tenuous peace because both sides knew that a surprise was no longer possible. Therefore, the legacy of 1940 is one of transparency. The invisible fence effectively ended the era of the secret strike. It forced humanity to move away from the shadows and toward a world where communication and data are the ultimate currencies of power. But as we reflect on this, we must also remember the cost. Behind every blip on a 1940s oscilloscope was a human being. There was a young German pilot, perhaps only 19 years old, trusting in his invincibility. There was a British plotter in a basement, exhausted and cold, moving a wooden marker across a map. And there were the civilians in London, Coventry, and Berlin, whose lives were changed forever by the beams that guided the fire to their doorsteps. As a generation that values doing things right and respecting the tools, we can look back at the Battle of Britain as the ultimate case study. It reminds us that technology is never just a gadget, it is a reflection of our values. The Germans used their precision to enforce a doctrine of aggression. The British used their ingenuity to build a system of defense. In the end, the shield proved more durable than the sword. Today, when you look up at a clear blue sky, it's easy to see only the clouds, but many of us know better. We know that the sky is never truly empty. It is a highway of information, a sea of radio waves, and a testament to a time when the world was on the brink, and the only thing that saved us was the courage to see what was invisible. As we close this chapter of history, let's carry that lesson forward. May we never be so arrogant as to think we've seen it all, and may we always have the wisdom to listen to the steady tone of truth, even when the world around us is in chaos. The Luftwaffe trusted in Hitler's shadow. The world survived because a few trusted in the light they couldn't see. And that, perhaps, is the greatest reward of all, the peace that comes from knowing the fence is still standing, the watch is still being kept, and the empty sky is no longer a place of fear, but a place of infinite possibility. History, much like a well-built machine, only reveals its true lessons to those willing to look beneath the surface. If you've appreciated this deep dive into the technical and human chess match of 1940, I'd invite you to join our circle. By subscribing, you're helping us keep these stories of ingenuity and grit alive for the next generation. And before you go, I'd like to hear from you in the comments. Do you remember the first time you heard about the secret war of radar? Or perhaps you have a story of your own regarding the technology we discussed today. Your perspective adds a layer to this history that the textbooks often miss. Thank you for your time and for keeping the record straight.